If you're a facilities manager at a university, you know students rely on the cafeteria for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the occasional late-night snack. So when a dishwasher breaks down and dirty plates pile up, the mess hall can turn messy in the blink of an eye. Enter Grainger. With over 1 million industrial-grade products and fast delivery, the product you need now is never far away. So you can turn that dishwasher back into a lean, clean washing machine. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Welcome to our January book club episode, which is dedicated to Disappoint Me by Nicola Dinan. Disappoint Me is Nicola's second novel and tells the story of Max, a 30-year-old published poet who works as legal counsel for a tech company. When Max falls down the stairs at a New Year's Eve party and wakes up in hospital alone, she begins to reassess life as she knows it. When Max meets Vincent, a corporate lawyer with plenty of his own baggage, as their relationship grows, his secrets begin to catch up with him, but will they sabotage their relationship? This novel is a funny and moving exploration of millennial angst, race, class, and identity. And if you haven't read it yet, please pause this now and go buy yourselves a copy and come back when you're done. Nicola is a writer. She grew up in Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur and now lives in London. Her debut novel, Bellies, won the Polari First Book Prize, was shortlisted for the Diverse Book Awards and Mo Sucharan Prize, was a finalist for a Lambert Literary Award, and was longlisted for the Gordon Byrne Prize and Brooklyn Public Library Book Prize. Her latest novel was published just last week and has already been chosen as a Best Book of 2025 by Cosmopolitan, Stylist, Elle, Vogue and GQ. Here to chat all about it, welcome Nicola to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. I've been so excited for this. Before we dive into you and your work, I have to ask you one of my favourite questions, which is, what are you currently reading?
So I'm currently reading Intermezzo. I was going to wait until the paperback because I still find the idea of a £20 hardback astonishing.
Awful.
However, I saw it. I managed to get it for half price, which is great.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I'm currently reading it. I think it's fantastic. I think there's so much growth between the books. I've listened to interviews with Sally Rooney where she doesn't seem too focused on growing as a writer, but it seems that that growth is sort of occurring regardless. But I'm obsessed with Ivan, not so obsessed with the older brother, but in a way that feels very considered and intentional. And I'm really enjoying the journey.
Oh my gosh, I need to know the full review when you've finished. It's so good. And I listened to an interview that she gave with, I think it was the New York Times. Was it the New York Times? I listened
to that one too.
Yes, It was such a good interview, and I feel like it's so rare to hear her giving interviews, and it was great. I absolutely loved it, and I was really surprised actually that she said that she wasn't considering adapting any more of her work, because I could just really see Intermezzo being adapted, and I thought it would be so great on screen. But I respect her choices.
No, me too, definitely. And I think, from what I know, she was very involved with the adaptation of Normal People, less so with Conversations with Friends. But I think working in film and television is such a different process from writing novels. And I can certainly, as a novelist, just understand that desire from, detaching oneself from that other industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it true that Bellies is being adapted?
So, I mean, I've sort of alluded to the ups and downs of TV in my last answer, but I think, basically from the standpoint of right now, I don't think that there's going to be an adaptation anymore, though it was sort of hotly anticipated that there would be, and there was an auction for the rights. I think naturally the business goes through ebbs and flows, and I know the TV industry has hit particularly hard, or rather been hit particularly hard by things like the writers' strikes and also, broader concerns around streaming revenues and those sorts of things. But I know there is the theatre adaptation in the works, which is really
Oh
exciting.
my
I'm thinking
gosh.
about it. Nothing set in stone for the moment, but I know a script has been written for the theatre adaptation, which is really exciting.
That
I
is
have
so
it because,
exciting.
I haven't
Right.
written the script for the play because I don't think I have enough experience with theatre to have even attempted something like that. And
Fair.
knowing what the ideas are for adaptation, I know I wouldn't have been able to come up with how they've managed to so creatively put some of the more expansive elements of bellies within the confines of a stage.
I can't tell you how excited I am about this
Oh, I'm happy to hear
news.
that.
And my friend Emma, who I have actually got a question from her that I will play later, but she's an author and also a playwright. And I know as soon as she gets wind of this news, because Bellies was one of her favourite reads of last year, as soon as she finds out about this, she's going to be like, Hannah, we're booking tickets, we're going. So that's really exciting. We should get on to your second novel, though, which
Mhm.
is what you're here to talk all about. I absolutely loved Disappoint Me, and I'm already seeing a lot of love for it online with people receiving early copies. So I'm really excited to hear from more people that have read it. So listeners, do get in touch with us. We would love to hear your thoughts. Now, I do think this is a perfect January novel because it obviously opens on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. And as I said in my intro, Max falls down the stairs at a New Year's Eve party, wakes up in hospital alone, and then she starts to reassess her life and is kind of doing veganuary and is making all these kind of crazy choices and being like, what is going on with my life? What do I need to change? Am I happy with where I'm at? All those kind of anxieties that we all sort of get in January. And I was curious why you wanted to open the novel around that time and what your own feelings are around New Year's.
That's a really interesting question. I think I wanted the novel to open up with a great sense of intended resolution, and
Yeah.
that Max falls down the stairs at this New Year's Eve party, which is more damaging, I think, to her emotionally than it ends up being physically. Although at the time everyone is very concerned for her
Yeah.
health after she takes a tumble down those stairs. But, I wanted the novel to start with this very clear sense of someone resolving to change something they perceive to be fundamentally wrong with their life. And I wanted to focus on Max's particular resolution, which is I'm going to find a boyfriend.
Yeah.
I'm going to dive in to this well-tested pool of heteronormativity and see how it goes. And, that resolution for me was particularly interesting because it's, I think even Max pokes fun at herself for it, but it sort of would make, every feminist, myself included, bring a palm to their face. And it's definitely, something you wouldn't really be okay with your friend making
Yeah.
that. Like, why not start crochet or something or join a running club? But at the same time, I think it's really reflective of the pressures a lot of people, and particularly women, face after, migrating out of their 20s and into their 30s
hmm
when we meet Max. And I think at turning 30 has saddled her with the weight of other people's expectations and
hmm
her own expectations as to what her life should look like. Which, you and I have just turned 30 within the
Yeah.
last year, so I'm sure we can both relate to that.
Yeah, for sure. I wasn't actually sure how old you were, so I'm really interested in that because I think it is such a kind of unsettling time when you're kind of approaching your late 20s and you're turning 30. You have so many people, and I don't know what it's like for you, but like having so many people kind of questioning whether when you're getting married or like when you're settling down or are their kids going to be coming up soon, or like if you're a creative, it's like, oh, well, are you still happy doing that, or are you going to do something now that will make you some money so you can buy yourself a house and da da da.
Absolutely.
And I feel like it's such a stressful time, but I really loved the way that you navigated it through Max.
Well, I guess I was going to say that Disappoint Me was very much a response to me feeling those feelings. In turn,
Yeah,
when I turned 27, which is the age I started writing Disappoint
right.
Me 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, I started to notice the air shift around me. Heterosexual women were referring to their boyfriends as their partners. people were people were talking about the future, not
Yeah.
just talking about 6 months in the future, but actually talking about what they meaningfully want in the future, like
Mm-hmm.
5 years ahead.
Yeah.
And all that to me was really terrifying, I think, particularly as a woman who's been trying to forge what is quite an unstable career,
Yeah.
and then also as a trans woman and not really knowing where my place among this rubric of heteronormativity is,
Yeah.
and, how I'm supposed to sort of assimilate into those very heteronormative expectations.
Mm-hmm.
But, I don't think that's a struggle inherent to the trans experience or limited to the trans experience. I think talking to a lot of my friends who are, very career driven and haven't really focused too much on romantic relationships being their priority, they too felt this anxiety really deeply.
Yeah.
And so I started writing it when I was 27 as sort of a prospective exercise. When I think of bellies, I started writing bellies when I was in my mid-20s. I'd probably just come out of the period in which bellies is set, which is that very early, messy early 20s period of
Yeah.
who am I? Disappointment was sort of the opposite, where I wasn't reflecting. I was really thinking about the anxieties that might plague me in a couple of years to come, the things that might start really weighing heavily both on me, but in my romantic relationships. And it's been fascinating in that respect because, there's almost I felt a bit like, almost like Cassandra of my own life. Like there's a sort of a prophetic nature to the novel where a lot of what I've written has come true.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's always that question of, oh, well, are your characters based on you? Are you writing yourself? And I think I've become more comfortable with the notion that I'm writing characters which reflect my own experience and
Mm-hmm.
draw from that. But there are a lot of ways in which I feel like I'm based on Max, in which, life has imitated art rather than art imitated life. And a lot of these things I imagined for myself at 30 when I was 27 have actually come to be. And I've been editing these sentences, which are happening concurrently with my life, but I'd actually first written those sentences 2 years before. It's been really strange in some respects.
I love that. As I said, I'm so interested in, reading about the sort of age that we're at and the anxieties that we're facing, and it kind of makes you feel less alone. And I really loved, speaking about Max being a poet, but also having to navigate working a job that is earning her money because, there's not a ton of money in the arts. And I'm assuming that's what you were getting at, because I was like, I feel it. I'm an actor and I'm working multiple jobs, and I know that it's because my money and my career is quite unstable when it comes to my artistic career, and I'm sure it's the same for a lot of people in these industries. But you wrote, so there's a part of the book when Max is thinking about another writer's success, and she says one of life's great ironies is that many people are successful precisely because they'll never feel like it. And I was curious what your own feelings are on success, because to me as an outsider, you've achieved so much, and of course I've listed that off in my intro, but I wondered what it was like, how it feels to you, even though you've achieved all these things. Like, does it feel like that?
That's a really interesting question, especially since, I'm publishing a second book. And,
Yeah.
During that time, I'm reflecting so deeply on what I consider success to be
Mm-hmm.
and whether or not I, feel successful. And the reality is, I think we're often blind to the facts in our lives. And when it comes to being artist, even though you have achievements, the instability
Mm-hmm.
that you face as an artist can be quite a blinding force.
Yeah.
Being in the sense of, being longlisted for a prize, for example, doesn't necessarily put the meal on the table. Or, I
Yeah.
can, I have this lovely trophy that I won for winning a prize, but, I can't eat it.
It's so real.
And I'm so grateful for that. But there is sort of an aspect of being extremely conscious of this instability that we as artists face, and focusing on the worries that come with that. There's a sense of, is that feeling of success worth having if I don't feel secure and safe?
Mm-hmm.
And I am luckily at a point now, I've written 2 books, published 2 books. I have a third one that's written, and there seems to be sort of a consistency now with career and, some feeling of safety, a lot more safety than I think other people who are working in the arts might have if they've gone all in on their artistic career.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really grateful for that. And, I wake up every day day, I feel feeling extremely grateful for the circumstances which I currently find myself in. But that doesn't mean that looking into the future isn't scary.
Yeah.
Knowing that there's no clear path towards career progression
Hmm.
that traditionally exists in more formalized, stable careers. And that can be difficult,
Yeah.
that can be difficult. And like I said, it can be a blinding force for any success that you might have, and that it sort of pushes you to not recognize those accolades necessarily.
Yeah.
But it disappointed me, I was wrestling as I was writing it with a lot of those feelings of looming professional disappointment.
Hmm.
If you kind of think about the timelines, I wrote a lot of Disappoint Me, the vast majority of it whilst I was waiting for Bellies to be published.
Hmm.
And I think I sent it to my publisher, what would be the substantially complete draft, probably the week of Bellies being published.
Wow.
And so I was dealing with all of these feelings of what happens if it doesn't work out. And for Max, it sort of quite patently hasn't worked out in the way
Hmm.
that hoped, and in a way in which she feels desperately sad about. She
Hmm.
feels sort of tortured by envy for her ex-boyfriend Arthur, who is a much more successful writer than her, is actually able to focus on it full time as a career, doesn't have
Hmm.
to do the side job as Max does. And this thing, which should be a positive, this publishing a book of poetry, which is amazing, becomes quite a sad thorn in Max's
Yeah.
side. And so I was really working through, almost in anticipation, the feelings of disappointment that might wait on the other end of publishing Bellies, or
Hmm.
the feelings of disappointment that just might be peppered throughout my career and already have been, and to some extent, I've experienced disappointment. We spoke about the TV adaptation earlier.
Hmm.
That's one big disappointment.
Yeah.
And I think writing Disappoint Me helped me process those things quite preemptively. And we see Max's journey with creativity throughout the book. We see her
Hmm.
try to connect to why she writes, like,
Yeah.
why is it that she writes? And I think sometimes these successes that you mentioned, the accolades, can also distract us from
Yeah.
why it is we enjoy what we're doing.
Yeah.
They sort of rely on the validation of others
Yeah.
rather than really connecting artists with why they do the verb, like why
Yeah.
they create, why they act, why they write.
That's so true because we do. I mean, I certainly find myself being sucked in by the validation. I'll do a performance and then come off, and if you've got people telling me that I've done a really great job, I'll thrive off that. And it's like, well, actually,
Yeah.
like I should take the enjoyment from doing the thing rather
Well,
than the after the fact. But obviously, it's
yeah,
so hard. It's like with anything, you want to know you've done a great job, and receiving that
absolutely.
validation, it kind of. I feel like it pushes you on because when times
Yeah.
are really hard and you feel like, oh, am I actually very good at this? You can kind of reflect on the good times that you've had and the things you have achieved and kind of reassure yourself with that.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
don't think validation is a bad thing. I think it should
Yeah.
be nice. It does feel nice,
It
but it
does.
can't be the only good you feel with respect to it.
Yeah,
I think
for
what I've
sure.
really been thinking about is like, when am I happiest when I'm writing? And at what stage of the novel am I actually happiest writing it? And I think, I've just started a fourth novel.
Oh my gosh.
And I think this is the stage that I love, where I'm working on it entirely privately.
Yes, yeah.
And it's occupying my brain space when I'm going for a walk. I'm working out these plot points, and it's a really wonderful internal thing. And I find that as soon as it's going to edit or being shared around or optioned for different things, it becomes something else, and it no longer becomes just about the creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've been reflecting on that a lot, and I think you see glimmers of that in the novel with Max's journey for sure.
For sure. And I want to talk about a relationship in the book that is really important to Max. And it
Mhm.
sort of guides her through any kind of issues that she has in her personal life, in her professional life. She's always got her friend Simone.
Mhm.
And I loved their dynamic because it feels like they're more like siblings than friends because they've seen each other through everything. What inspired Simone's character and the sort of role that she plays in Max's life?
Yeah, I love that question. So, I mean, I think on the face of it, the central relationship in Disappoint Me is that between Max and Vincent. Vincent.
Of course, yeah.
Vincent is the man she ends up in a relationship with after making that New Year's resolution. But I still wanted the prevailing impression for a reader to get is that the friendship with Simone will endure any romantic relationship,
Yeah.
Vincent or otherwise, that Max might have. And I think that's certainly been my experience in friendships, particularly friendships with other women. They just seem to endure.
Yeah.
And it's never been a question of, okay, well, and I think when I think about going after a breakup I had a couple of years ago and thinking, and sort of in the depths of that breakup, it really just struck me that my friendships that I currently had would probably last at least a few more decades.
Yeah.
And I was struck by the wonder of that, the ease of those friendships, how, of course, friendships take work, but how easy that work often was and mutually pleasurable that work was as well. And I really wanted to show that kind of love within the book through Max and Simone's friendship. They went to university together, they went to school together. They, as you said, have really been through life together. And also they were both closeted in their own ways.
Yeah.
Growing up, Simone was sort of the prettiest girl at school, the most popular girl at school, dating a rugby player who realizes she's gay and sort of transforms in a way which makes them having to confront their sort of old girl group of friends extremely uncomfortable because these girls are extremely traditional. And, they have that connection of feeling slightly on the outside, only understanding themselves slightly later in life compared to their peers. And I wanted to draw that sense of connection between these two characters. And I wanted it specifically to be between, two queer women, one trans, one not, as I think that's illustrative of some of the strongest relationships in my life as well.
Yeah. And obviously, that's something, there's a kind of solidarity element that comes in those queer friendships. But I think as well with the female friendship, there's always a real intimacy in female friendships that I don't think you see in men's friendships, I should say. And I think we see that with Vincent and Fred, in that their friendship is just nowhere near as intimate and close as Max and Simone. They don't stand by each other through everything in the same way that Max and Simone would, if that makes sense. I really liked the parallels, maybe not parallels, the differences between those relationships.
Yeah, I think parallels is a fair word to use. And I think, I hate to draw too strong any generalization between men and women, but
Of course, yeah.
I do think it's something we sort of anecdotally observe. And I think we see such a fluid exchange of emotion in Simone and Max's relationship, and a more difficult exchange of emotion between Fred and Vincent, particularly regarding the events which occur in their past, told in those chapters on Vincent's gap year more than 10 years before Max's timeline in 2023. And we sort of see them unable to talk about difficult things in a way which would sort of be unimaginable for Max and Simone. And I wanted to sort of draw a portrait of that very sort of constrained form of masculinity. And, writing Belly is one thing that I think people praised was the way it challenged some conventions on masculine friendships, particularly in the friendship between Tom and Rob, which was very emotionally and physically intimate.
Yeah.
Honest and refreshing in a way. But in this book, I wanted to maybe veer into what we might consider to be a more traditional masculine relationship between Fred and Vincent, and untangle it from that end, from the end of what is more conventional and what is wrong with it, and why friendships like that persist.
Yeah, I think there is an element of toxic masculinity in their friendship, but I think you're right. Like, I didn't even realize I was generalizing then when I was saying it. I think, it was just an interesting dynamic to look at against Max and Simone, for sure. I want to talk about the food descriptions in the book. So I'm veering off slightly, but I need to ask about those because I love talking about food. And, there's a lot of food descriptions, whether they're eating out, whether they're cooking at home. It feels like food is a real kind of connection point for, maybe Max and Vincent as a couple, physical, maybe for Max with her family. You know, there's lots of ways that it's used as sort of a connection. Do you cook a lot yourself? And, you know, why did you want to include so many food descriptions in the book?
Yeah, it's not so intentional, which is interesting. It's,
Really?
yeah, I am not like, oh, needs a food scene here. I
Of
just
course, yeah.
find myself structuring lots of scenes around meals and
Mm,
also sex, I think.
yeah.
I don't think I write, and I'm thinking that I've been thinking this reading into Mezzo at the moment. I don't think I write particularly like sensual sex scenes, and I don't approach sex scenes from a particularly like sensory angle. Like I don't think I'm overly descriptive of the nature of a person's lips or what, what it feels like to kiss them or feel them in other ways. But I find meals and sex very interesting because I feel like they're often a way of bringing people together.
Hmm.
And as a result of that gathering and the emotions involved in such
Yeah.
gathering, forcing these conversations that those characters might be avoiding.
Hmm.
I'm interested in like people taking the opportunity post-coitally to talk about something that outside of that post-coital glow
Yeah.
they might find really difficult to talk about,
Hmm.
or outside of having established the intimacy or of just having slept with someone, they might have had real difficulty in raising or feeling vulnerable. But because there's already that intimacy and vulnerability established through the act,
Hmm.
there might be greater comfort in therefore talking about, this issue. And with meals as well, it's like an opportunity for two people to sit around the same meal, sharing it and really approach one another with something they're thinking about, or even when we think about groups or family meals, it's an occasion both with friends and family. We see it in the book with Max's family and Vincent, and we see it with, Max and Vincent and their friends, Fred and Aisha, as the meal times are often these sites of collision because these people are being brought together and all of these tensions that people might have otherwise been avoiding become unavoidable.
Hmm.
And so I think that if I were to sort of analyze my own work with an outsider perspective, that's probably why I naturally gravitate towards those scenes of food and sex. But
Hmm.
I also just love food. I grew up in Hong Kong and Malaysia, and naturally, in those countries, there's such a food-driven culture.
Hmm.
And I've always just understood food to be an enormous part of life. My boyfriend is really interesting in that he sort of eats to survive. Like,
I
he
don't
eats,
understand those people.
yeah, he eats to live, whereas like I live to eat.
Yeah, me too.
And so naturally food is just on my mind. And I think my fiction is a product of what's on my mind. And so inevitably food works its way in there. How could I just bring up an item of food and not, at least describe a little bit about how
Yeah.
it feels so unnatural to me. I think some people might find it tiring because they approach food from a slightly different mindset to me, or have a slightly different experience of it, or even experience my writing differently. But for me, it just feels necessary.
Hmm.
If food's on the table, I'm going to describe what it is.
Yeah, but it's so interesting hearing you speak about what you feel that your writing is like, because to me your food scenes felt very like sensory and immersive, and I felt like that with your sex scenes as well. You know, you feel like
Okay.
you're in this really intimate space with these characters. It does feel very immersive. So I'm always really interested to hear how the writer feels writing it to
Oh,
how the
I'm
read.
glad. But I mean, to be honest, I'm glad because I'm like, I'm like, I think maybe because I'm reading into Mezzo and I'm like, wow, this is some like sexy stuff.
Yeah.
And you can't help, and it's a dangerous thing for a writer, but you can't help but compare the different ways in which writers approach
Hmm.
mechanics of different scenes. And I like to think my writing isn't devoid of sensuality.
No, not at
I think
all.
I think for me, it's more that when I'm thinking about sex
Hmm.
or thinking about writing about sex more specifically, the least interesting thing to me is the sex itself, rather
Yeah.
than all of the noise around the sex and what's
Yeah.
happening leading up to it, what is shown through hesitancy and certain actions during the act, rather
Hmm.
than the actual sexual pleasure itself.
Of course, yeah. You do write very good sex scenes, though, I will say,
Oh,
because I
thank
think they're
you.
such a scary thing to write. And I've tried to write them myself, and I really kind of struggle with, I need somebody to read over it and be like, is this cringe? Like, it's so hard to know because I've read so many cringe sex scenes. So I'm
Mhm.
always really scared that that's how it's going to turn out when I write them. And I've had a lot of writers tell me the same.
But
It is quite scary to write about.
it's definitely scary, and I think it's also, I think, like for a lot of people, I think it's for most, vast majority of people, not in a bad way, but I think sex is just kind of embarrassing. It's like
Yeah,
you feel naked,
yeah,
you feel exposed. And I
for
think
sure.
writing about it is definitely very exposing
It's
and something
vulnerable,
that
isn't
makes
it?
you
Being
feel very
vulnerable.
naked as well. And it's the idea of someone cringing at it is,
Hmm.
more painful. It's like no one's going, if someone cringes at your description of a piano, you're sort of like, whatever. But if someone cringes at your description of sex, it feels much more like an attack.
For sure, for sure. I've got to go through two questions that were submitted for you, but before I do, I have one last question, and it was something that, I mean, I love your work and I think you're an amazing writer, but one thing that I really love is your sense of humour, and I think that really shines in both of your books. And I find it really interesting when somebody is writing about quite dark things and then they will find the humor in that. And I think it's obviously a very human thing to do that, but it always interests me. And I don't want to give any spoilers away for people that haven't read the book, but there are quite dark scenes in the book in terms of Vincent's past. And throughout the book, there's moments where like Max receives bad news, trying to tread very carefully here, but she's still kind of making jokes around that. And your humor, you like I said, your humor stays consistent throughout. Where do you think this humor comes from, and why is it so important to you to keep that humor in there?
I just can't help myself. Like, I think it's just a natural way that I write, particularly if I'm writing something set in the world in which I live.
Hmm.
And it's hard for me to not inject that sense of humor. And I think what I loved about writing Bellies and Disappoint Me, and that is that I found so much room for absurdity.
Yeah.
And that is a really great thing. There's a quote that I love by Somerset Maugham from a short story that he wrote called The Back of Beyond, which is a quote about cynicism. And it's all about sort of like laughing in the face of disaster. And someone accuses him of this character of being a cynic. And he says, if life has taught you tolerance, you find in it more to smile than to weep. And that always sort of very much rings true for
Yeah.
me. I think if you've gone through terrible things or have had to endure them, then, I think that's what I sort of equate with tolerance in that situation. And it brings so much levity to the soul to be able
Yeah.
to treat certain heavy things with a lightheartedness. And that's not to say that I ever want to be flippant about things like violence and the other, horrible things which happen within the pages of Disappoint Me. But at the same time, I want to tread on those things whilst dancing between the full appreciation for the darkness,
Yeah.
while being able to, where it's appropriate, add a sense of levity for the reader. And
Hmm.
I just think it's so important to know. I think all comedy is timing, and I think that
Yeah.
exists with books as well. And there's just a right time for it. I
For
think,
sure. Yeah.
particularly from Max's timeline, there's so much of what happens to her is just sort of absurd. As she falls down the stairs at a New Year's Eve party, it opens up with a really terrible thing that happens to her. But I think she's very quickly able to assimilate these terrible things and make jokes out of them. And for her, I think it's a function of being able to cope with the terrible things which happen in life. And I think it's a very human way to cope. And, although I wouldn't encourage that anyone avoid the reality of what's happening to them, I think we're all familiar with that,
For sure.
method of coping and enduring. And humor is such a fantastic way to do that.
Yeah, humor is often used as a survival tool, isn't it?
Yeah,
For
definitely.
sure. And I think, when I've been through kind of grief in the past within the family, it's often a way that we've used to get through that is we've laughed about, things that the person that we've lost has done. And
Mhm.
I think it is, you know, it's a way to get through it because, as they say, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. And
Exactly.
sometimes you know, you don't want to get lost in the sadness of it all. But I just absolutely loved your humour, and I loved both your books. And for the listeners, Disappoint Me is out now when this episode goes live. So as I said, if you've not already read it, what are you waiting for? Go buy it now. I'm popping a link in the show notes. And of course, Bellies is also out now in paperback. Before we get into rounding off with a recommendation from you, I did ask people for questions. We've had a couple. One of them is from Kerry Downs, who I believe is a 2025 debut author. So Kerry said, I know that Bellies is fictional, but I assumed if some people incorrectly assumed that Ming is heavily based on Nicola, how does she deal with this, and did the possibility of parts being perceived as non-fictional ever impact on her writing of the story?
Thanks for that question, Kerry. I think it's an inevitable part of being a writer sometimes. I think it's particularly an inevitable part of being a writer from any marginalized
Yeah.
group, whether that's because you're trans or, you know, you're Asian or Black or a woman. I think when you're writing from the perspective of when your narrator inhabits maybe the same marginalized group as you, audiences are far more ready to equate narrator to author.
Yeah.
And the difficulty that is that I found it made me move into quite a defensive position where I would sort of flatly deny that Ming had much connection to my experience. But at the same time, Ming is a, you know, half mixed race, half Malaysian Chinese trans woman. And I too am that. And so it's very hard to write a character which inhabits that experience and not draw from my own experiences at all. So, but you're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place because you don't want to admit it, because then people won't let go of that and
Yeah.
might see the work as autobiographical. I think as I've moved towards publishing a second novel, and I'm now talking from a place of having done a year and a half of press for Bellies,
Yeah.
I now am a lot more comfortable with those associations, in part because I do, even though I think sometimes they come from a misguided place, just accept that those associations are something I can't necessarily control, and that
Yeah.
also a flat out denial of them would be untrue. And I also don't see anything wrong with some aspects of my novel relying on autobiography.
Yeah.
I don't think it makes my novel any less fictional, somewhat ironically. And I don't think it makes my novel any less credible as a piece of fiction. I really love the book How to Write an Autobiographical Novel by Alexander Chee. And I think it's fantastic reading from any writer thinking about that question of autobiography. And yeah, to answer your question simply, I've learned to just accept it.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting because when we're writing, we are, and you know, I've used it with my performances and stuff, you know, we are taking parts of ourselves and trying to find ways to resonate, to relate to a character, you know, so you are
Absolutely.
using parts of yourself and parts of your own experiences that might be similar to that character. But what I find interesting is where this question can sometimes come from, which is often not directed at white straight men. You know,
Yeah.
they're not asked, oh, is this white straight man that's also in your novel? Is that about you and your life?
Mhm.
It just doesn't seem to be the way. But I do think we all, you know, will find ways to relate to the characters that we write.
And I think, you know, one thing I love, an anecdote I love sharing is that when I released Bellies, of course, you know, set in contemporary London, a lot of people around me were like, oh, which character is based on who? And I remember, and, you know, that wasn't just Ming and Nicola, it was also every other character, and thinking who that might be
Yeah.
in, you know, the world surrounding me. And I remember one of my closest friends stepping in and saying, well, actually, I just think all of the characters are Nicola. And I don't think he didn't mean that in a derogatory way, because obviously all the characters in Belly are very different, but he very astutely could recognize that there was some trace of me in every character. And, you know, I think all characters are to an extent a triangulation between ourselves, what we observe, and the character we're writing. And so, you know, our perspective and our own subjectivity are sort of unavoidably incorporated into that writing.
Yeah, for sure. I have one last question, which is from friend of the pod and author Emma Hines. So I'm going to play this voice note and hopefully you can hear it.
Hi, Nicola. This is Emma Hines. I loved Bellies so much. It was one of my top 5 books of last year, and I'm so excited for your next book. My question is about Bellies and the choices that you made to sort of swerve some of the bigger milestones in the narrative that people might expect to see, like breakups or people moving or things like that. And I wondered how much of that was sort of choreographed or written inside your head or even written down somewhere, even if it didn't appear on the page. Yeah, so excited for your next book. Really looking forward to it. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Emma. That's an interesting question that I haven't actually been asked in that way before. I think when it comes to what I chose to leave out of Bellies, the thing which stands out most to me is that I left a lot of detail of Ming's transition out of the book. You know, we sort of understand that we see Ming come out to Tom, and then we sort of jump to a year after when she's gone through aspects of medical transition already. There are ways in which she feels relatively far down the line, and I wanted to focus on that in that instance because I think as a trans person, the physical aspects and the change in physicality, although central to the novel, felt like the least interesting aspect of her transition to me. And I wanted to focus much more on the emotional life and run against maybe what I have perceived to be an obsessiveness about the physicality of trans people and this idea of a before and after, and the swan emerges. And I really wanted to avoid caving into that sort of fascination that I've seen in people who aren't trans. And there are other aspects in which I want to avoid certain things, like actually showing certain things, plot points, or rather events, which are sort of key to the novel. And of course, you mentioned breakups as well. And, you know, I wanted to present that to the reader through the play Thin Frames, which is the play within a novel, because I wanted to create a sense of ambiguity between two people's versions of events, which is much more effectively done when you leave something out and you only have two people to describe their feelings towards it and their emotions following and their version of events. And that's what we see with the play. We see Ming's version of events with the breakup, and we see that those feelings of betrayal that it instills in Tom and the fallout from that. And also, you know, their emotions with respect to their breakup are so heavy that they almost render the facts of the breakup irrelevant. And I think that's what that was trying to show. And then Bellies ultimately is a novel that takes place over like 4 or 5 years, you know, 4 or 5 really important years in these characters' lives. And inevitably there are things which you have to skip out. And, you know, I wanted to, in a lot of cases, stick the reader in media res into what was going on in these characters' lives, to wake up with Ming in New York and watch her go to lectures rather than see that process of her moving there. I had so much ground to cover. I just thought it was so much fun to drop the reader in and almost disorient them. And I know that's something that some readers might not have vibed with. You know, I intentionally also left out who is narrating each chapter and left that for the reader to find out. And I was very comfortable with permitting that kind of disorientation within the novel, though I hope there was some enough to guide the reader anyway. But it just felt like I wanted the readers to be involved in the characters' lives, but in an exciting way, you know, not necessarily. I think there are many ways in which Bellies tries to capture like the minutiae of the day to day, but I also wanted it to feel fast paced and exciting and to feel like there were flashing lights and new places. And I think a lot of that is captured by being selective about what to leave out.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that there's a lot of love for Bellies. I will say that Bellies is very much like a catnip novel for actors.
Really?
I loved you, the writing the play aspects and them going to see the play, and you know him sitting at the back and kind of observing what elements apply to their relationship.
Mhm.
And I also loved the inclusion of Meisner because it's such a specific technique that
Yeah.
if you haven't been in a classroom where people have used Meisner, you won't understand how unhinged it actually is.
Yeah, well, I've never been in that situation. I learned about it from an actor that I know. And I'm so, you know, earlier I said I was like, I couldn't write the adaptation for Bellies for Theatre, which I think actually on reflection might surprise people because I'm like, I actually don't have any theatre experience. And that's something
Oh
I
my
really had
gosh.
to seek elsewhere in writing Bellies so that I could sort of understand, what it looks like for
Yeah,
someone to ascend quite quickly in the theatre world as Ming is doing, and, what kinds of plays might Ming be doing and what might she be writing. And I had so much fun writing the theatre aspect, and it's so nice to hear that it resonates with actual actors.
for sure. No, it really did. I've been telling quite a lot of my actor friends about that book and being like, oh my God, you need to read this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I loved it so much. And I love Disappoint Me, and I can't wait to be able to chat to more people about Disappoint Me. Before I let you go, because I've just seen the time and I've been ridiculous and kept you for far too long.
It's been
Um,
great.
But I love to finish on asking for a recommendation. So this can actually be anything. It can be books, film, TV, whatever you'd like to
Mm.
recommend.
You know what? I have a list of books on my phone
I
that
love
I
this.
keep when people ask for recommendation. You know what I'm loving is the Dune books.
Really?
I'm on book number 5.
Oh my God.
And I absolutely love them. I can't stop reading them. I think they're such interesting, they're so philosophically rich in
Hmm.
terms of our relationship to technology, the despotic tendencies of humanity. I find it utterly fantastic. I recommend the Dune series. I think to think that came from, the mind of one man, although actually, that Frank Herbert's wife contributed a lot to the books as well. I just think they're fantastic. So on the science fiction front, that's what I recommend. There's another book called Edinburgh by Alexander Chee, which I actually only just read this year. So I mentioned his book, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, which I think came out 10 years ago. And Edinburgh, I think, came out 20 years ago. But
Oh
if you can get
wow.
a copy of that, that's a fantastic book as well. And what else have I written? I just read a book called Palm Meridian, which is coming out later this year.
I feel like I've heard about this.
Yeah, by Grace Flahive, and it's amazing. I loved it. It's about a queer retirement community in 2060 Florida.
Oh
So
my
it
God.
looks at, and it's interesting because now, like, retirement communities in Florida are known to be like the STI capitals of the United States.
Oh my God.
And so it sort of borrows from that, but in a queer setting, but set in sort of at the front lines of the climate disaster. So it has lots of elements which I'm absolutely
This
loving.
sounds amazing.
Yeah, you have to read it.
I
I have
have to read
blog.
this. Oh my God, thank you so much. Those are excellent recommendations, and I am wholeheartedly recommending again that the listeners grab themselves a copy of Disappoint Me. And if you haven't already read Bellies, please go and do so. Links for both of those are in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. You can follow us at Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. Nicola, where can they find you on social media?
At Nicola Dinan.
Gorgeous.
Very
Thank you
lucky got
so
the
much.
OG.
Thank you so much for joining me on A Pair of Bookends. I've loved chatting to you, and as I've said 100 times now, I love your books, so thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, and thank you, listeners, for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.